WWE Hall of Famer superstar Billy Graham died on Wednesday, 1 month short of his 80th birthday. He had been in the hospital for months with various infections. I know he had gone deaf. He lost over 80 pounds. Sepsis and multiple organ failure was the cause of death. His wife Valerie, in a Facebook post on Monday, said that he was on life support and the doctors wanted to take him off. But she refused, and she was praying for a miracle. Like so many of the other times, he kicked out at 2.5, but there was no kicking out this time. It's amazing he survived as long as he did, considering all the health issues that he's had for the past few decades. He had a liver transplant back in 2002. All the years of steroid abuse just ravaged this man's body. He even cut promos back in the day talking about how he was going to take 7 Dianabols a day. And I mean, can you imagine Hulk Hogan coming out before WrestleMania 3 and talking about upping his decadurabolin cycles so he could slam that nasty, stinky 800-pound giant? But you know, that's just how it was. And he was one of the greatest promo guys in the history of the business and one of the most influential. Without him, there would be no Hulk Hogan. There would be no Jesse the Body Ventura, who clearly modeled large aspects of their characters and their promo styles after Billy Graham. And Hogan was the top star of his generation. There was no bigger name, no more widely recognized name in wrestling at that time than, and really in that entire decade, than Hulk Hogan. Had Superstar come along 5 or 10 years later, maybe it would have been him instead of Hogan, but you know, he was ahead of his time in that way. And without Hogan and Hulkamania taking off when it did, who knows where WWE would be today? You know, the reason Vince McMahon calls his wrestlers superstars is because of superstar Billy Graham and just what he represented. That it wasn't just about how good of a wrestler someone was and the moves that they knew. It was about the total package. You know, their look, their verbal skills, their charisma, their personality. That's what makes someone a superstar. And so now everyone is a superstar, even though very few of them actually have the verbal skills and the charisma that Graham had. But he won the world title, his one and only run with the belt from Bruno Sammartino in 1977. That ended Bruno's second run with the championship. That was not his 8-year run. This was the 3-year run that he had, which, you know, they will claim that Roman Reigns is going to beat that run when he passes him, if he passes him. But he really won't, because Roman's longer run is with the Universal title. It's not with the WWE title. Unified or not, it does not matter. That's not going to stop them from claiming it anyway. But Graham was a huge draw as the heel champion. Tons of sellouts in Madison Square Garden and other places. They were doing big business at the box office with him on top, which is why he tried to convince Vince Sr. not to take the belt off of him and put it on Bob Backlund, which was McMahon's plan from day one. From the very day that Superstar Graham won that championship. I mean, you talk about long-term booking. He was told months ahead of time that he was going to be winning the title, right down to the date that he would be dropping it. And Vince Sr. was adamant that we are not changing from these plans. Bob Backlund is my guy. We're not changing from this plan. And when he lost the title, he went into a deep depression. He was never the same again. You know, he left the company for a while. He dropped off the face of the earth. He got out of the wrestling business completely. He wanted nothing to do with it, to the point that people thought he was dead. There were rumors about him being dead. I covered this a few years ago in one of my This Week in Wrestling History segments. This was in 1981. Gorilla Monsoon had a weekly column in the Philadelphia Journal. And in one of his columns, he announced that superstar Billy Graham had died of cancer. Well, that came as news to Billy Graham because he was still very much alive. And as the story goes, Monsoon had heard a rumor that he died, and so he went with it. No fact-checking, he just went with it in his column. When Graham came back the following year looking like a different person, you know, he was a lot smaller. He was doing a kung fu type karate gimmick. I think he may have shaved his head. He didn't draw well in Philly, probably because people thought he really was dead. And it was an imposter Billy Graham. And Monsoon never did print a retraction. Of all the stories to print a retraction for, claiming that someone was dead when they're really not would seem to qualify. But when the Kung Fu stuff fizzled out, Vince Jr. brought him back again in '86. And this is the run that I remember, because this is around the time I started watching WWE. his run as champion, that came before my time. So the first that I knew of superstar Billy Graham, I remember seeing him at one of the Slammy Awards ceremonies. I don't know if he was accepting an award or giving an award, something with Hulk Hogan on stage. I have only vague memories of which one that might have been 87. But I remember him being the manager for Don Morocco, who, by the way, Don Morocco, pretty damn underrated promo guy himself. If you're not familiar with him, you need to check out his work. But one of the earliest angles I remember on TV was Graham. He was still in great shape when you would look at him. You know, he still had the big biceps, but he had very bad hip issues. He was not moving around very well. I remember the angle. He was being held down by Slick and Butch Reed as one-man gang came off the ropes and splashed him. And I think they were writing him off TV, and that turned out to be his last in-ring appearance. That was it. I know he did commentary for a while. Then he had a falling out with Vince, which would not be his first or his only one. He testified in 91 in the Dr. Zahorian steroid trial that he had purchased large quantities of steroids from Zahorian back in the 70s and the 80s. The following year, he appeared on that infamous episode of Phil Donahue's show. And what a cast of characters that was on that stage. You had Bruno Sammartino on the far end, on the far right. Billy Graham is sitting next to him. John Arezzi, who was a radio show wrestling host at the time, he was next to him. Dave Meltzer, and then next to Meltzer and his mullet was Vince McMahon. And that was only the right half of who was on that stage. He was on Donahue claiming that he shot up Hulk Hogan with steroids and that he personally witnessed Pat Patterson sexually abusing one of the ring boys, which he later admitted was a lie, and he made it all up. And later on, he said that it was the most shameful moment of his life. In the September 1993 issue of the WWF magazine, Meltzer had a mention in his bio about a column in the magazine, and it rang a bell with me, because I still have all of my WWF magazines. I started collecting the magazines in early 92. Shortly after Flair came in, I had a subscription, and I have all the magazines. And there was a magazine, the September 1993 issue, had a column called Now It's Our Turn. This was the first of what was supposed to be a series of columns called Now It's Our Turn, where they would respond to various media outlets and disgruntled wrestlers who were critical of them and critical of the product. Today, it would be the equivalent of responding to the news websites or podcasts like this one. I should be so honored that they would ever think to respond to anything that I have to say. But as somebody who was reading those magazines back then, it was completely out of character for that magazine to do a feature like this, because a lot of what was in there was mostly just kayfabe stories about the wrestlers and personality profiles and pay-per-view results and fantasy warfare and trivia. It was geared towards kids and teenagers. So imagine a 9-year-old seeing this Now It's Our Turn, talking about superstar Billy Graham, a wrestler they wouldn't even know of because he was before their time, talking about him testifying as a rebuttal witness on behalf of the government and the steroid trial. Just imagine processing this as a child. This was a 2-page feature, no less. It had 4 columns of text. This was not like a short couple of paragraphs talking about their own investigation into who is the real Billy Graham. And they called him a high school dropout who never held a regular job, who had tax liens against him and non-support orders against him for 2 children he left behind when he was married for the 5th time. I swear, it's like Vince wrote this himself. There's something very appropriate about Lex Luger being the one on the cover of that issue, showing off all of his muscles. So it got real nasty, and Graham was no innocent angel in all this. Nobody came out of that looking good. They all came off looking like scumbags, except Bruno. Bruno never came off that way. But they thought so little of this man. That didn't stop them from inducting him into the Hall of Fame. They didn't have any issue inducting this high school dropout, tax delinquent steroid abuser into their Hall of Fame in 2004. Since then, Graham, he's had his on and off battles with the company. Usually whenever somebody had something bad to say about him, or when Vince cut off his allowance, basically they were paying him for a time. And when they stopped paying him, he turned against them real quick. And when Chris Jericho said some things about him for commenting in the media, after the Chris Benoit murder-suicide. And I think also for trying to control Jericho's speaking time during Eddie Guerrero's funeral, because Graham was leading the funeral. And he supposedly limited people to only a few minutes of speaking time. Jericho didn't know at the time that Graham and Eddie were close, that they knew each other. Graham even bought a burial plot in Arizona next to Eddie. And Jericho made a crack about it during his speech, I think, and Graham just blew up on him for it, which was not the time nor the place. But there's a famous shoot interview with Billy Graham where he literally wishes death upon Chris Jericho. He says he'll burn in hell, he'll happily cut out his tongue, and he'll watch as he bleeds to death on his own blood, among other over-the-top things that he said. You know, look, you take the good with the bad. I've covered all of this on the podcast over the years. You've heard me tell these stories before when it comes to Billy Graham. Just because he passed away doesn't mean I'm going to shy away from it. But I can also acknowledge just how big of an influence he was on the wrestling business and how successful he was when he was at his peak. Unfortunately for him, his peak didn't last as long as it should have because Vince Sr. was very set in his ways. Who knows how many more years he could have been champion for? Who knows how many more sellouts he could have had? And then maybe turned around and gotten a big babyface run out of it when he eventually turned. That didn't happen. And it's awful, all of the health issues that he had to go through, even if a lot of it was self-inflicted, and he was very open about that and talking about, you know, the way he abused his body with steroids. But still, nobody should have to go through the hell that he had to go through with his health over the years.